Well, warm greetings to you all, and thank you very much for inviting me to join you for such an important service as this one on Remembrance Sunday. I often tease you about the supposed rivalry between Essex and Kent, although you would probably say between Kent and Essex. See what I mean? But today we are all united in thanksgiving for those who made the ultimate sacrifice. Both my granddad served in the First World War. Grandad Morley came home minus a hand, with just a stump, while Grandad Clements was gassed at Ypres and suffered with bronchial problems for the rest of his life. A generation later, my own dad was left behind after Dunkirk and had to be smuggled out of France and back across the Channel. My wife Dawn lost an uncle in the First World War, although of course she didn't know him. She's not that old. And I'm not boasting about my family, because many of you will have your own stories to tell. And we all thank God that the sufferings of those generations mean that our generation has been spared. So far. Anyway, on this Remembrance Sunday, let me ask you a question. Has anyone here ever been to Oswestry? And immediately the main drawback of this format suggests itself. I can't see how many hands have gone up. So for those of you who haven't been there, it's in Shropshire, and it's the last town in England before you get to Wales, which means it's also the first town in England out of Wales. So when we were on holiday in Wales last year, we decided to cross the border and visit. It's a very pleasant little market town. But if you do go to Oswestry, you can't ignore its most famous son, Wilfred Owen, perhaps the greatest of the war poets. Mind you, he wasn't a very good poet until he went to war. He was born in Oswestry in 1893, and he became a devout Christian in his youth due to the influence of his mother. Thank God for mums, eh? Later, he worked as an unpaid lay assistant at a church in Berkshire. He was actually in France when the First World War broke out, and he even considered joining the French army. But instead, he returned to England and trained at Hare Hall Camp, which is near Romford, which is, of course, in Essex. Oh, see, I've done it again. In 1916, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Manchester Regiment, and, like so many others, he served on the Western Front. He had a terrible time. First, he fell into a shell hole and was knocked out. Then he was blown up and lay unconscious amongst the remains of one of his fellow officers. Not surprisingly, he was invalided back to Edinburgh with shell shock. I don't mean it wasn't surprising that he went to Edinburgh. I mean it wasn't surprising he had shell shock. And in hospital, Craig Lockhart Hospital, he met the famous poet Siegfried Sassoon. Now, Wilfred's doctor encouraged him to channel the terrible dreams that he was suffering into his poetry. And influenced by Sassoon, he began to write poems based on his experiences. He went from a mediocre poet to one of the greatest of the English poets and wrote some of the greatest English poems of the 20th century. Many of them are still read regularly. Wilfred wrote to Sassoon and said, "You have fixed my life." And then he added ominously, "however short." He could have stayed on home leave, but instead he insisted on returning to the war that he hated, because he wanted to tell the horror of war in his poetry. like so many of that generation, he was a brave man, and he was awarded the Military Cross. On the 4th of November 1918, he was killed in action, leading his men across a canal. A week later, on the 11th day of the 11th month, as the church bells rang out to celebrate the armistice, his mother received the telegram telling her of his death. He's buried in France, and in 2018, to commemorate the centenary of his death, a statue was erected in Oswestry. There he is, in uniform, with some of his poems flowing from his pen. It is well worth a visit. And at this point, 6 minutes into my talk, some of you are thinking, Steve, we didn't come here for a history lesson. We want some Bible teaching. Well, because of his Christian background, you won't be surprised about the biblical imagery that you can find in his poems. See whether you can spot which Bible story he is alluding to in this one. It's called The Parable of the Old Man and the Young. So Abram rose and clave the wood and went and took the fire with him and a knife. And as they sojourned both of them together, Isaac the firstborn spake and said, My father, behold the preparations, fire and iron. But where the lamb for the burnt offering? Then Abram bound the youth with belts and straps, and builded parapets and trenches there, and stretched forth the knife to slay his son. When lo, an angel called him out of heaven, saying, Lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do anything to him. Behold, a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Offer the ram of pride instead of him. But the old man would not so, but slew his son, and half the seed of Europe, one by one. So, did any of you Bible students spot it? Once again, are the hands going up? Did you spot Genesis 22, when God told Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac? Yeah, but Wilfred got it wrong, didn't he? Because Abraham didn't sacrifice Isaac, did he? Instead, he did sacrifice the ram. Yeah. But not in Wilfred's world. He was 25 when he died, but many who died around him were even younger. Private John Condon was 14 when he died at Ypres. He had lied about his age to sign up. The Kaiser was 55 in 1914. Lord Kitchener was 64. Lloyd George was 51. Isn't it strange how the old men always send the young men to fight and die? Vladimir Putin is 70. Now, I've got no statistics to prove this, but I strongly suspect that the soldiers coming back to Moscow in body bags will be in their teens and their 20s. The point of Wilfred Owen's poem is still being made for him today. So, shall we read the Bible story that inspired Wilfred? As I said, it's from Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 to 18. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham? Here I am, he replied. Then God said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said. "But where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." Wilfred calls him Abram, which was his original name, but in the Bible God renamed him Abraham, which means father of many. But he wasn't the father of many. He had 2 sons, Ishmael, the son of the slave girl, and Isaac by his wife Sarah. So how come God told him to take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love? Couldn't God count? Well, of course God can count, better than you. How many hairs are there on your head? Unless the answer is 0, you don't know. But God does. He promised Abraham that he would look after Ishmael, but he said, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." From Isaac would come the house of David and the line of the kings, all the way down to Jesus himself. As he said, "I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." You can check out the family tree at the very beginning of Matthew's Gospel if you like. But not now. Do that later. So the call must have come as something of a shock to Abraham. It was true what God said. He did love Isaac. Of course he did. He was the child of promise. And yet God was demanding his sacrifice. Now, we rightly remember the suffering of the men who died. Let's never forget too the suffering of the fathers and the mothers and the families who waved them off. We're told why God did this. God tested Abraham. And Hebrews tells us how Abraham was able to respond to such a test as this. Hebrews 11:19, Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead. Now that's great faith, because do you know how many people had been raised from the dead by the time you get to Genesis 22? I'll tell you, precisely 0. But strengthened by his faith, Abraham set out to perform his grim duty. And Isaac went willingly. We're not sure how old Isaac was by now, but he was old enough to carry the wood. And as Abraham was 100 when Isaac was born, I think the young man could easily have outrun his ancient dad, don't you? He even allowed himself to be bound. So much did he trust his father. I don't suppose all those who went to war went willingly, but the point is, they went. Abraham raised the knife and passed the test. So the angel called out to him to stop. And as it says, he sacrificed the ram instead. Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. Where was it caught? In a thicket. How was it caught? By its horns. By its horns. That means its flesh wasn't torn. And that means it was a perfect sacrifice. Peter described Jesus as a lamb without blemish or defect. Peter knew Jesus well. For 3 years they lived together, walked together, ate together, and slept alongside each other. Peter knew Jesus. Now, I think I'm confident enough to say that my wife knows me and loves me. But next time you see her, if you ask her, has Steve got any defects? She'll say something like, how long have you got? The closer you are to someone, the more you see of them, and the more defects become apparent. But not with Jesus. Peter saw him every day. But as Hebrews says, Jesus was tempted in every way, just as we are, yet was without sin. Isaac asked, where is the lamb? And God provided one. But not that day. The ram was a temporary provision. From Isaac's own family would one day come the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Did you notice that? The sin of the world. It's sometimes said that our war heroes died for God, king and country. And we are so thankful that they did. Well, for king and country anyway. Because strangely, the German soldiers had Gott mit uns inscribed on their belt buckles. God with us. And I'm sure he was. just as he was with Wilfred and the British troops, because Jesus said, "I am with you always to the very end of the age." And he said it in Aramaic, not in English or German. He also said, "Greater love has no one than this, that he lay down his life for his friends." And again, we thank God for all those who died for their friends around them and the people back home. But Jesus died for the sins of the world. He certainly died for his friends, and his definition of who his friends are those who follow his commands. But he also did what no soldier can do. In fact, if a soldier did do this, he would be called a traitor. Jesus died for his enemies. As he died on that cross, he prayed, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And so God provided Jesus, the Lamb, and accepted his sacrifice, that we might be forgiven. Then Jesus rose again to give us the power to obey his commands, so that we might truly become his friends. At this season, we sincerely thank God for Wilfred Owen and all those who sacrificed their young lives for their own nations. But thank God for Jesus, who gave up his life for this whole sorry world. Next time I'm with you, I should be with you, if you see what I mean. God willing, I should be crossing the Thames to spend a Sunday morning with you early next month. I do hope you are looking forward to it as much as I am. Goodbye.